This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. It's been 80-some years, but the New Deal is still on our radar screens. Conservatives want to repeal it, and progressives need to remind people about what FDR really wanted out of it. Law professor Jack Balkin explains how progressives can also use the Constitution's original language to fight conservative attempts to roll back the New Deal. Historian Harvey Kaye reminds us of FDR's Four Freedoms speech and the legacy that remains unfulfilled. And micropolitics activist Madison Paige focuses on the need for more people to run for office at the very local level. Are you tired of Tea Party Republicans and Rush Limbaugh dominating the airwaves? Do you want the facts you won't get on Fox or even on CNN? Then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. We all get a little exasperated when conservatives talk forever about the original meaning of the Constitution. But law professor Jack Balkin says progressives have just as much right to the original wording. For example, free speech, equal protection of the law, and voting rights. And we say hello to Jack Balkin. He's the Knight Professor of Constitutional Law and the First Amendment at Yale Law School. He's also director of Yale's Knight Law and Media program and author of a recent article on how liberals can reclaim the Constitution. Jack Balkin, thanks very much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Thank you.
You argue that progressives have as much right as conservatives do to use the original text of the Constitution as support for their ideology. But why don't they do it?
Actually, they do. If you look at any number of cases involving the Bill of Rights, you will find that liberals make constitutional arguments and make a reference to the text of the Bill of Rights. And the Equal Protection Clause, they do. The Due Process Clause, they do. That's not a problem. They have for a long time. A lot of the issues that come before the courts these days have to do with social insurance, Social Security, the healthcare case, and the protection of those kinds of rights, economic regulations, the environment. In those cases, what happens is that conservatives have been coming up with new constitutional theories to prevent the passage of legislation that would be in the public interest. The reason why liberals haven't used the Constitution in these contexts is actually because they won in the New Deal. The New Deal established that the federal government had the power to do all this stuff, and conservatives have just dredged up new theories to try to roll back parts of the New Deal.
Well, and it seems conservatives cling to the exact wording of the Constitution to block progress. I mean, would you say that the meaning of the Constitution then actually goes beyond its words?
I'd actually start from a very different proposition than the question. Conservative theories these days do not look to the exact wording of the Constitution. These are made-up theories. The whole fight over the health care bill, Obamacare, was based on a completely made-up theory that had no basis in the Constitution, and it almost won. It almost struck down one of the major accomplishments of America in the last several decades, which is universal health care for everybody. This is not clinging to the exact wording of the Constitution. This is making things up. When the Supreme Court of the United States struck down one of the crown jewels of the civil rights movement, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, striking down part of it and making it inapplicable, that was completely made up. That was based on a theory that came out of nowhere and had no basis whatsoever in the text of the Constitution. And the text of the Constitution, in fact, is pretty clear about Congress's ability to pass legislation to protect the right to vote. It's in the 15th Amendment.
We're speaking with Jack Balkin, the Knight Professor of Constitutional Law and the First Amendment at Yale Law School. So every time Justice Scalia says the founders did not take such and such into account, should progressives be answering that with yes, they did?
I think that progressives and liberals should look into the entire history of our country and see the many fine men and women who have made arguments on behalf of the Constitution, including during our first founding and also our second founding with the Reconstruction Amendments, and point out that there were a lot of people who made arguments that make perfect sense today in terms of both democracy and liberty and equality. And I think that what you get often in conservative arguments is a stunted view of American history and a misunderstanding of the American tradition. When you look at the Constitution as a whole, including both of our foundings, and you look at the progress of American democracy, what you discover is our Constitution, understood in its best light, is a liberal and egalitarian document. It's a document which we should be proud of and which has inspired many other countries around the world.
Is it worse right now in terms of the way these interpretations or made-up interpretations are going? Is it worse now than it's ever been in history?
No, it's come and gone. You have to go back, however, to the turn of the 20th century, the period that law professors sometimes call the Lochner period, to find interpretations that are as made up and brazen as the interpretations today. So we're going through a rough patch in terms of how our Constitution is being treated. But it's been treated badly before in the past, and we've gotten through it.
Cyclical, like so many things, I guess, then, where it's you've got your ups and downs and it all comes back to the beginning.
You have to have a certain degree of faith and hope in the eventual progress of the constitutional project. I think that is the liberal view. I think that is the correct view.
Is the Constitution, or is there a level of ambiguity in its words that any party in any argument can find something in there to prove a point? And if so, was that perhaps done on purpose, foresight by the founders?
I think you're partly right about that. I mean, if you look at our Constitution and then you look at constitutions written in the several states and then you look at constitutions around the world, you see they have a very similar set of features. First of all, they're frameworks for governance. They don't spell everything out. A lot of things are left to be developed later on in time. That's deliberate. That's because when you draft a constitution, whether it's for a state or a national government, you can't take everything into account at once. But secondly, there's a distribution of different kinds of norms. There are hard and fast rules. The president serves 4 years. Doesn't say he serves a reasonable period of time. There are principles and standards. A standard would be something like no unreasonable searches and seizures. A principle is freedom of speech or equal protection of the laws. And you look at our Constitution, look at the state constitutions, look at national constitutions around the world. They all look like this. That's deliberate. That is, some things are fixed. You can't get around them. They're designed to prevent people from doing bad things. Then there are standards and principles which are supposed to be worked out over time. That is not unusual. It happens in every constitution I've ever read.
You know, and specifically for me, the one that really seems to get me is the Second Amendment and the interpretations of it. I mean, that seems to really be boiling right now in the public's minds and eyes, and that there is an interpretation on the left and an interpretation on the right that are nowhere close to each other. Do you see that the same way, and how do you bring that to some sort of median?
Yeah, well, so the position I take on the Second Amendment may not be the position that most liberals take, but I'll tell you what I think.
Sure.
What I think is that at the time of the first founding, 1791, the Bill of Rights, they were mostly thinking about a Republican duty to serve your country and to give your body up against invasion and against tyranny. It was a Republican duty. By the time you get to the Reconstruction, our second founding, the real problem is that the militias are now controlled by whites in the South who want to kill black people. And so the Reconstruction framers want to make sure that blacks have the ability to arm themselves to fight off the Klan and other folks who wish them no good. So by the time you get to the second founding, it's become a liberal individual right of self-defense. So that the basis of the current fight over gun rights is really about Reconstruction. It's not the first founding. That's why the Heller decision is completely confused. It doesn't really understand the history very well. And it seems to me that if liberals should say, look, we recognize that there is a right of self-defense that's in the Constitution. That's living constitutionalism, really, what it is. But it has to be subject to reasonable regulation. And if you look at the 44 states that have protections for the rights of self-defense, you'll see that the Supreme Courts in all these states treat this as a matter of reasonable regulation, and that's the way we should do it here in the national arena.
The conservative counterargument against the living Constitution is that the document itself provides for change through legislation or the amendment process. What's wrong with that analysis?
There's nothing wrong with that analysis. In fact, that is how you change the Constitution, through amendment, or you can do it through legislation. But the point is, our Constitution, like every Constitution, was drafted with standards and principles in it. Those standards and principles have to be put in practice over time. That practice of putting our principles of freedom of speech and equality, the right against unreasonable searches and seizures, is the expected feature of a Constitution with a Bill of Rights. A Bill of Rights means nothing if you can't make it work over time. And that's exactly what Americans have done over the course of their history.
Jack Balkin is the Knight Professor of Constitutional Law and the First Amendment at Yale Law School, also Director of Yale's Knight Law and Media Program. Professor, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. We look forward to speaking with you again soon.
Thank you.
And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future and help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. Franklin D. Roosevelt famously advocated progressive ideals in his Four Freedoms speech of 1941. And historian Harvey Kaye says liberals have failed to sustain that vision. We'll talk to him about that in just a moment. Right now, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
The story exploding out of Ferguson, Missouri, is doubly infuriating. First, there is the obvious outrage of yet another unarmed black teenager, Michael Brown, being stopped by one of the town's white police officers as he was walking to his grandmother's house. A scuffle ensued, and Brown was shot to death by the officer. He was then left lying in the street for hours, during which time the police didn't even bother to notify his family. Understandably, furious citizens have erupted in protest. Outrage number 2 is that Ferguson's police, practically all of whom are white in a town that's 2/3 black, did not respond to the public outcry like police officers, but like an occupying army. What was needed was a calm, professional, and empathetic response. Instead, the police confronted Ferguson with full military force, rolling out in armored Bearcat vehicles, hovering helicopters, riot gear, camouflage outfits, and body armor. They approached the unarmed citizens with assault rifles, grenades, tear gas, nightsticks, and a macho attitude. It was a tactical commando assault on civilians, the vast majority of whom were doing what they should be doing, calling autocrats to account. But wait, where did this tiny town's police force, supposedly made up of peace officers, get such weaponry and a military attitude? From the Pentagon, which has quietly been militarizing America's police departments for the last 2 decades, sending billions of dollars worth of Bearcats, helicopters, machine guns, etc., to any Mayberry police chief with Rambo fantasies. This is Jim Hightower saying, your town and mine are being militarized too. We must halt this perversion of proper policing, or we'll be the next Ferguson. For starters, tell your governor, don't militarize my block. You can do it by going to www.change.org/petitions.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. New Deal historian Harvey Kaye says President Reagan turned FDR upside down and inside out, and progressives have to reclaim his legacy. And we are joined now by Harvey Kaye, who is the Ben and Joyce Rosenberg Professor of Democracy and Justice Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay. His latest book, The Fight for the Four Freedoms, What Made the Greatest Generation Truly Great. Harvey Kaye, thank you very much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Thank you. It's great to be talking to you.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you with us. To begin with, a lot of our listeners may not know exactly what you mean by the four freedoms. Can you tell us what they are and how they developed?
Okay, well, it's important just to state that the four freedoms was a vision or a promise articulated by Franklin Roosevelt in January 1941 in his annual message to Congress, which we think of as the State of the Union message each year. And in this speech, he was warning Americans of the dangers of the war already underway in Europe and in Asia, and how there was no doubt that, as he said, the dictators were going to target us. He had little doubt. And that because of that, it was necessary for the United States to prepare for war. But the preparation for war, or at least preparation for a major national defense, also involved a Lend-Lease program for Britain, which was already under siege, obviously, by the Nazis, by Germany. But what he also said, and this is the fundamental thing, is merely because we face this crisis of security, merely because, our lives are threatened by this war, doesn't mean we should give up or suspend what we've achieved during the last 8 years of the New Deal in the fight against the Great Depression. He said, rather than give up, if we're going to prepare for war, if we're really going to sustain ourselves in advance, what we need to do is actually build upon what we've achieved. And he laid out a series of initiatives that they might pursue to sustain the New Deal and advance it. And then he said, looking ahead, in his own mind, expecting war, he said, beyond the war, we need to make a world characterized by four essential human freedoms. And those four freedoms, he said, were freedom of speech and expression, freedom of worship, and then, he went on and said, freedom from want and freedom from fear. So the four freedoms are those: freedom of speech and expression and worship, freedom from want and fear. And they became basically the ideals for which the Americans fought during the Second World War, when, after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th later that year.
Mm-hmm. Is it too much of a stretch to say the four freedoms are what we fought World War II about? I mean, that is to say, were they on the minds of the average soldier on the battlefield?
Well, that's a really good question, because pollsters of the day, and especially, and even historians to this day, say, well, most Americans weren't thinking about the four freedoms. They couldn't even recite them exactly. And, there's good evidence. But actually, I've found plenty of evidence that most Americans had those four freedoms on their minds. Freedom of speech and freedom from worship were fundamental to the American understanding of democracy. But also freedom from want and fear. They had just fought 8 years of battles against the powers that be, both political and especially corporate, to begin to attain freedom from want and fear. And they had no intention of giving all of that up in a defeat by fascists and imperialists. The other thing is that in the course of the war, not only were major groups and major organizations regularly pronouncing the imperative of fighting for the four freedoms, but when soldiers were asked to talk about what they were fighting for, even though they couldn't recite the four freedoms exactly, they pretty much talked about just those kinds of things, from the freedom of speech and worship to freedom from want and fear. Now, they may all have had their own understandings of that, but they all seem to be envisioning that what they had done in the 8 years before the war is what they were fighting about, and they had no intention of coming back and suffering a reversal of what they had achieved and might yet achieve.
We're speaking with Harvey Kaye, Professor of Democracy and Justice Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay, and discussing his latest book, The Fight for the Four Freedoms, What Made the Greatest Generation Truly Great.
There's something I want to add to what I just said about
Sure.
Did they have it on their mind? This is really crucial. In 1943 and 1944, Roosevelt commissioned the National Opinion Research Center, which was then at Princeton University, to run a series of surveys and ask Americans what they wanted to achieve after the war. And a series of possibilities were listed. And regularly, to the tune of 85%, Americans endorsed the idea of guaranteed work for all, of aid to students to go to university, of national health care. I mean, on every single question that implied a liberal or social democratic vision, 85%, that includes Republicans and Democrats, 85% of Americans said that's what they wanted, which led Roosevelt then in 1944 to expand upon the four freedoms and give a new State of the Union address, January 44, which comes to be known as the Second Bill of Rights speech, in which he lays out the idea, the possibility of enacting new amendments to the Constitution guaranteeing essentials for economic security for Americans. I just think it's important to realize just how great Americans had in their minds, how strong they had in their minds that they had already begun in the 30s the battle for the four freedoms, and they had no intention of turning around but actually advancing them. I just think that's really important to remember.
And the president listened to the people.
He did indeed, and he, as I say, and he proclaimed and pronounced the new economic Bill of Rights in 44.
Yeah. Now, your book takes aim at the trope created by President Reagan, his speechwriters, and Tom Brokaw, that the people who lived through the Depression and World War II were the greatest generation. Isn't labeling one generation as better than another kind of ridiculous?
Well, definitely not. Okay, I mean, the greatest generation deserves that title. You know, these young men and women of the 30s and 40s who went on to make the United States the strongest and richest nation on earth, and then followed through on their promise in the 1960s by way of Medicare, Medicaid, Civil Rights and the Voting Rights Acts, EPA, OSHA, Consumer Product Safety Commission, and reformed the immigration laws, which had not been reformed since 1924. So this was an amazing generation. But the thing is, they would be great merely for having won World War II. But what made them the greatest generation is that they were the most progressive generation in American history, which, by the way, Reagan had every intention of suppressing the memory of. I mean, by the 1970s, as he's running for president, well, he ran first in 68, but when he ran in the 1970s, he made every effort to suppress the memory of what that generation, his own generation, was about. And if you read Tom Brokaw's work, though he gives a nod to their, liberalism, Brokaw and the rest of the Greatest Generation tribunes make nothing of the progressivism from the 1930s to the 1960s that marks so much of that generation.
Well, you mentioned President Reagan, a New Dealer who became very conservative. How did he exploit the four freedoms for his own purpose? Was it a dishonest rendering of history?
Oh, regularly. I mean, it's interesting that when he was running for president and then accepted the nomination in 1980 from the Republicans, he was a master of using, but even more to the point, abusing the past. His acceptance speech at the Republican convention quotes Lincoln, Thomas Paine, the American revolutionary, and Franklin Roosevelt, taking their ideas out of context and somehow making them a champions of conservative politics, which is absolutely absurd. But what happens is Reagan knows who the heroes of American working people are: Lincoln, Paine, and Roosevelt. And keep in mind, most working people by the late 1970s are absolutely fed up with the Carter administration because Carter had turned out to be not at all the liberal that he had appeared to be, that he had run as in 1976. So Reagan is trying to appeal to what later comes to be known as the Reagan Democrats by literally sort of pronouncing the Reagan Revolution by using Lincoln's, Paine's, and Roosevelt's words. Now, while he was president, Reagan, he would regularly refer to the four freedoms, but never mention what they were. And why was that? Because he had every intention of rewriting them. And in 1987, July 3rd, 1987, he went to a Chamber of Commerce gathering, huge numbers of people at the Jefferson Memorial of all places. And he announces his intention of seeking to enact a new economic Bill of Rights, playing off of Roosevelt's ideas. But what his Bill of Rights involves, that is Reagan's, is basically free markets. Free markets and free markets and free markets. And it's a complete denial of the idea of economic security that Roosevelt and a generation had fought for. And then, over and over again thereafter, and especially even in his farewell address, when he says to the American people, you know, we must teach our young people that America is about freedom. And he makes every effort to expunge freedom from want and fear once again when he says America is about freedom, freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom of enterprise. Now, I could go on and on about Ronald Reagan and those four freedoms, but what we find is a man who had memorized so many of Roosevelt's speeches because he was such a fan of Roosevelt, and later becomes not simply a Cold Warrior, which, I mean, you know, that in itself was not a surprise, but that he becomes a right-winger. I mean, it really was opposed to Social Security, wanted to privatize the TVA. You name it, the New Deal for him was now the evil. And in the 70s, when he's running for office, he keeps playing on the Roosevelt stuff, but in a way that literally turns Roosevelt upside down or inside out. But keep in mind, whatever Reagan did, whatever he did to suppress the memory of what the four freedoms were really about, let's not forget that we liberals and progressives had failed to sustain that vision.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking with Harvey Kaye, professor of democracy and justice studies at the University of Wisconsin, Green Bay, and discussing his latest book, The Fight for the Four Freedoms. To the extent that the Depression and World War II generation did overcome incredible obstacles, do you think it was more the legacy of belief in the four freedoms and the success of the New Deal than their exploits on the battlefield?
You know, I mean, let's put it this way, okay? I think what we need to consider is that both the New Deal and World War II are part of the same ongoing struggle in many ways. Okay, the New Deal enables the mobilization against fascism and imperialism in World War II. I mean, imagine if the United States had not pursued the New Deal with its relief, recovery, reconstruction, and reform efforts. It's hard to imagine the United States could ever have risen to the challenge that it faced in 1941 and 1942. So I think that the legacy of belief in the four freedoms, that it comes out of the New Deal. It's articulated by Roosevelt in 1941, and then the pursuit of the war and the deep commitment that Americans had to those four freedoms, and the understanding that they would, if you like, reinvigorate the struggles against inequality, the struggles against labor exploitation, the struggle against poverty, the fight against soil erosion and the devastation of the environment, that all of those things that had been happening in the New Deal, that's on the minds. I mean, the capacity to believe in America is renewed in the 1930s. So maybe, I don't know if I'm answering your question exactly, but I think it's important to realize that this is the creation of a generation, and that the overcoming of the obstacles are both the overcoming of the obstacles of the Depression and the confrontation with fascism and imperialism. Does that get at what you're asking?
I think so. Absolutely. Yeah. And that's where we'll end it. Harvey Kaye, Ben and Joyce Rosenberg, professor of democracy and justice studies at the University of Wisconsin, Green Bay. The book is The Fight for the Four Freedoms, What Made the Greatest Generation Truly Great. Harvey Kaye, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. Look forward to having you back again soon.
I look forward to it, too. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future to keep this show on the air and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. And finally today, did you know that half of all state legislature candidates have no opponent? Micropolitics activist Madison Paige does, and she wants people to start challenging them. And we welcome Madison Paige, who is a micropolitics activist. advocate and speaker, and co-founder of Bold Blue Media Alliance. It's a political services and training firm dedicated to giving state and local Democratic candidates and progressive causes the tools they need to run strong, credible, competitive campaigns in every district in America. Madison Paige, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure. First question, what is the definition of micropolitics? And second question, what is the Bold Blue Media Alliance?
Well, our definition of micropolitics is quite simply politics at the state and local levels. It's something that we have a strong commitment to at Bold Blue Media, and we want people to begin to focus on what's happening at the state and local levels, because those are the things that really, really affect people's lives. And so what we try to do here at Bold Blue Media is twofold, really. We try to do education, and we try to facilitate. We educate and facilitate. So on the education side, we have our magazine, a Bold Blue magazine, which is a monthly publication, subscription publication that gets really into a lot of state and local issues from all across the country. We also have our website, the Bold Blue magazine website, and our Facebook page and our Twitter account, and we are just constantly scouring the internet for things that are happening at the state and local levels that we want to make sure we're educating people about the things that are happening in various states across the country and in local communities. That's one thing. On the other side, we want to facilitate. We have education on the one side. Bold Blue Media is set up to facilitate campaigns, whether it's a political candidate who's running for a seat or a cause campaign. We want to make it possible for them to run strong campaigns as with their volunteer staff as easily and as efficiently and as affordably as they possibly can, so that we are enabling the democratic process to flourish. Mm-hmm. And there's a symbiosis between our educational efforts and our facilitation. The magazine subscribers obviously are helping us to facilitate the process of getting candidates, allowing candidates to run, allowing cause campaigns to run, to do what they have to do affordably. Our magazine subscribers are really the ones that are supporting that. So it's sort of a nice mix of collective efforts. We want to educate and we want to facilitate, and that's what we do, and we're passionate about it.
There are so many issues at which progressives really seem to be at a disadvantage, but you believe in shaping not just the issues, but shaping the electorate itself. How exactly does that work?
Right. Well, one thing that we like to say here is that trickle-down doesn't work in economics and it doesn't work in politics either. So
amen to that.
We think that the most effective way of shaping the electorate is to start at the local level. Because, let's face it, every person who's ever voted and every person who's ever going to vote has only done it for one reason. If you just distill it all the way down, the only reason people vote is because they think it's going to benefit them in some way. So when you focus at the macro level on these big national politics and national political issues, and you're talking about the debt ceiling and the deficit and foreign policy, those things affect us. But when you're talking about bus routes and school closures, those are the types of things that people who maybe aren't as politically engaged are going to really find that engages them at a core level. So, yeah, we want to make sure that we're focusing at the local level. We want to shape the electorate, help them to see how progressive policies in their own communities have benefited their lives. And we believe that if we can do that, that it makes it easier when you work your way up the chain and you get a senatorial candidate, a U.S. senatorial candidate comes into town and wants to talk about minimum wage or unions, then it makes it easier because that person has a basis that they can reference in their own experience that they've had at the local level and say, this isn't something I have to be afraid of. It worked here in my community, and I think this person is talking about doing it in Washington. So I think to build a more progressive Washington, and to build a more progressive electorate, we have to build to build a more progressive Washington, we need to build a more progressive electorate, and we can do that by appealing to people at the local level.
You're essentially getting the uninterested interested in things that they really care about at home, which then enables them to perhaps get more interested in some of the bigger issues.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Now,
I mean, politics is sort of addictive, isn't it?
Yeah. Now, we're speaking with Madison Paige, co-founder of Bold Blue Media Alliance. It's a political services and training firm. Since you're dedicated to building progressive causes and the Democratic Party from the ground up, do you agree with former party chairman Howard Dean's 50-state strategy, or has the party kind of left that strategy behind?
Well, I'm a huge fan of Dr. Dean and what his philosophy on the 50-state strategy and how he introduced it. I don't believe that the party has left that strategy behind, and in fact, used it to quite positive effect in 2008 and 2012. Dr. Dean's involvement or non-involvement notwithstanding, I think that there's room for a lot of different approaches. I mean, I think when you think about the fact that, the Democratic Party, there's over 3,000 municipalities and districts across the country, and there's over 50,000 municipal seats that are up for election in any given election year. The National Party doesn't have a limitless amount of money. Our unions, our large monolithic organizations have some concerns that, and they have to make tough choices. And frankly, so do a lot of state parties. The state parties have to make a lot of these same difficult choices. And there's so many thousands of people that are running for office at any given time, your mayors, your school board people, your city commissions, your county commissions, sheriffs, supervisor of elections. I mean, it's really sort of difficult for everybody to equally pay attention to those issues, but they are vitally important, and I think there's room for a variety of actors on the same stage. There's a place for what the Democratic Party, the National Party does. There's a place for state parties. There's a place for local committees. And there's a place for what we're doing here at Bold Blue. And I think we all have the same goal, so I think the idea is to figure out ways to work symbiotically and collectively so that we can enhance one another's goals, and some of us can do some things while others are not positioned to do those things. And I think if we can do that, there's room for all these different approaches, and then we can creating progress.
So does Bold Blue Media, in a sense, act as kind of a bridge from local to national?
I like to believe so.
Yeah.
I think that, state parties really have to make tough choices. Usually they're focusing on top-tier candidates, and a lot of times even the county-level committees just aren't getting the type of support that they feel they need. It's because it's very difficult. It's very, very difficult decisions that parties have to make. And so, we feel like here at Bold Blue, people are not paying attention to who's running for school board as much as they need to. And we want to just create an environment that allows that candidate and the volunteer staff that they're going to have, because they're not going to be able to go out and hire a big, the big campaign management firm and these types of things. They're going to have volunteers.
Yeah.
And what we want to do is bridge the gap between the multi-millions of dollars that you need to be able to run a strong campaign, and the fact that these smaller campaigns actually are going to be relying on volunteers. And we need to make sure that whatever they're doing, they are, we can bring them up to speed and give them as much competence as possible. So our services, our training are all designed to sort of bridge that gap and give these campaigns the greatest chance that they can possibly have to run strongly and competitively in their districts.
You know, though we live in a two-party competitive electoral system, you say that all over the country there really is only one-party rule. What do you mean, and how does that happen?
Well, I'll tell you what. In 2011, I'll give you, this is an astonishing statistic. In 2011, 80% of state legislative elections that were up for election, there was no primary competitor. 80%.
Wow.
And 50%, and this is just state legislatures, 50% of all the state legislative seats that were up for election in 2011 had absolutely no general election opponent. 50% of people that are sitting in state legislatures today are sitting there and never had to compete against anybody to be in that position. That is scary.
Yeah.
It's scary. And so what we say is, if there's no choices on the ballot, it's not democracy. 50%, and this is at the state legislative level. In 2011, those are statistics from 2011. It's even worse when we start getting into local politics, isn't it? I mean, we're talking about hundreds of voters as opposed to thousands or even millions that you see in presidential elections. So as we go down the chain, the numbers drop off even more. There's even less competitiveness at the local level than there is at the state legislative level, and we have almost 50% of state legislative seats that aren't even challenged.
Yeah, I actually see that in my own neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
You know, at the county level.
Me too.
Yeah.
Yeah, me too. We have a lot of that. I'm from Florida. We have a lot of that in Central Florida. You know, and it's really hard to field candidates. It's really hard, you know, and so this was part of, you know, the frustration that I had that sort of served as the impetus for what we're trying to do at Bold Blue. And the reason it happens, obviously, is because, you know, you're in a district, for example, that people feel like one way or the other there's no chance of winning. So, you know, you have a situation where people say, well, I don't really want to get involved in a political campaign if I can't win, and, you know, and who's going to want to do that? So what ends up happening is that the party begins to atrophy. People move away, or people die off, and there's no new people coming in. The party has difficult time raising money, having dues, holding events, and so then that leads to apathy. So you have this atrophy happening, and then you have more and more apathy, and it becomes like this downward spiral. And the more that happens, the more difficult it becomes to get someone interested in actually challenging someone.
Yeah. We're speaking with Madison Paige. I'm sorry, just going to let everyone know we're speaking with Madison Paige, co-founder of Bold Blue Media Alliance. And I apologize I interrupted you.
Oh, no, it's all right. So, yeah, but that's how it happens. And so what we want to do is we want to stop it. we want to put some kind of a stop in that downward spiral, and we have absolutely got to get more than 50. Nobody should be sitting in elected office without having to face an opponent.
Well,
nobody.
So let me ask you this, though. I mean, if you happen to be in one of those one-party districts or states, how do you, as an activist, find and persuade people to run for office? I mean, you said, oh, you know, there's no way I can win. Why am I going to do it? So how do you energize folks to go ahead and run?
Well, I think that if you're in one of those deep red districts where you're not going to win the seat, we have to redefine what it means to win, right? Because we only have two choices, right? If you're in a district like that, there's only two choices: do nothing, or make a decision that you're going to create incremental change. It's not like a district like that's going to be deep red one year and solidly blue the next. That's not going to happen.
Right.
We only have two choices: do nothing, or create an endeavor to devise a system whereby we make incremental change. And I think we have to redefine what it means to win. If you're in a district like that, winning doesn't mean winning the seat. That's not going to happen. But winning, if you haven't had somebody run for office in that district or even file for 10 years, winning means let's get somebody filed and let's raise some money to get somebody filed. And if you can just do that, you've won. Mm-hmm. If you have had somebody and you say, well, let's make it a goal to get 50 more people on the ballot. 50 more votes. We had 5% the last time a Democrat was on the ticket. Let's make it 8%. And you sit down and you crunch the numbers. You figure out that means you need 42 more votes to go. And I think there's a collective, in those types of districts, all the Democrats know each other, right? All the liberals, progressives, we all know each other in those districts. And I think, this is a collective effort. This isn't so much about this person is running for office and we're all supporting this person running for office. This is about creating a new definition of success and working collectively within your community and amongst each other to devise a way, a strategy to do it. And so what we try to do at Bold Blue is to facilitate that. We want to make that possible because that's a tough decision for any person or group of people to make. So what we want to do is say, hey, man, if you want to do this, we want to help. We want to support you 100%. We want to make this we want to make this possible for you, and we want to remove as many barriers for you as possible. So winning could be 50 new Democratic registrations.
Right.
And that's it.
Sure, absolutely. At least make a crack, right?
Yeah, exactly. So let's redefine winning. And I think when we do that, we do keep the party alive and active. We give people a reason to remain engaged. We give people attainable goals. And we're not seeing this atrophy and this apathy. We can actually set a goal and meet it. Mm-hmm. Set a goal and meet it. Set a goal and meet it. And we can monitor that progress across time. And that gives us a shot so that one day we actually have a shot of taking the seat.
Yeah. And I guess it's, we're in a world where everything has to happen 10 minutes ago. So it's, that makes it a bigger challenge. And I think if we, practice some patience and just say, look, let's just keep working at it, eventually, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. Somewhat related, how do you feel about term limits? Should it depend on the office, the state? What are your thoughts there?
Well, when I think about term limits, I'm always inclined to say, I don't really think term limits, when people talk about term limits, they're really talking about term limits. I think when people are talking about term limits, they're talking about corruption. They're talking about the idea that somebody is in office, and because of their length of time there, they have access, particularly to lobbyists and other types of folks that allow them to amass these huge sums of money, and they are able to avoid electoral competition as a result, right? They're able to say, well, nobody's going to beat me because I can raise $500,000 on my lunch break without leaving my desk.
Right.
So who would possibly want to run against a person like that? I think there's some benefits to having folks have a job for a long period of time. I think there can be benefits to it. So I don't have anything against term limits per se. I do have a lot of issues with the corruption that often results from it. And that's why what we try to do is say, listen, man, we want to level this playing field. That guy can raise $500,000 in 15 minutes by making a couple of phone calls. That means that now we don't have a democratic process anymore. We have a situation where people are going to be reluctant to challenge him if he's not delivering on his promises, because they feel like they have to at least be able to match him in order to compete with him. Well, we want to remove that barrier, and we want to say you can compete with him. You can compete with him. If he's not doing what he's supposed to do, then we're going to give you the tools to go in there and compete with him. And it doesn't matter. You don't have to match him dollar for dollar.
Okay. Madison Paige, micropolitics activist, advocate, and speaker, co-founder of Bold Blue Media Alliance. You can learn more at boldbluemedia.com. Madison, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. We look forward to speaking with you again soon.
Thank you.
And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for Stand Up Democrats. That's all for americasdemocrats.org. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Jack Balkin, Harvey Kaye, and Madison Paige. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook. For americasdemocrats.org, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us, support the show, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate.